Hello there, my name is Phil Williams and I would like to welcome you to Audio Angling, the podcast site of fishingfilmsandfacts.co.uk. I personally have never yet fished from Littlehampton in Sussex, but having just spent the past 40 minutes listening to a podcast interview done for the site by Greame Pullen, I have to say that I've been missing out on some truly amazing potential. Here, charter skipper Neil French gives a very frank and detailed insight into what the visiting angler to the port can expect. Not only that, he also provides a wealth of general information that could be taken and used anywhere around the country, which could be of benefit to all of us, regardless of where we choose to go afloat.
So Neil, what is your background history of actual sea fishing? When did you get into it?
I started probably when I was 10 years old as a small boy fishing on Muddyford Pier with a hand line, where I caught my first fish, which was a flounder of a pound, and went on from there to my own private boats, eventually having a Lock-in 33 which was based at Littlehampton Harbour. At that time I spent some 20 years in the electronics industry as a sales rep, and decided that I was absolutely fed up with sitting on the motorway for most of my life. Many people suggested to me that I might like to think about taking them out on a charter basis, and with that in mind I went out and actively pursued the purchase of Spirit of Arran, a 40-foot lock-in, and then proceeded over the following 3 years to get my ticket and all of the various certificates that were required to actually go chartering.
Okay, now you run this the Spirit of Arran. That's a 40-foot lock-in cruiser. Give us a bit of a breakdown, a bit of a rundown on the the engine, electrics, and that sort of thing, and what fish finder equipment you have.
Yeah, well, she's a 40-foot lock-in with a fly bridge, which is interesting. Makes it slightly different from the point of view that we can actually sit on up there as well and back down on fish, which gives it an ideal opportunity for us to do not only static fishing but also drifting and also potentially trolling should I take the boat offshore to other parts of the world in the future. She's powered by two 350 horsepower Sabre engines, both of which are turbocharged. That gives us a top speed of about 25 knots, cruising speed of about 16 or 17 knots, which is ideal for the opportunity, if we're having a bad day, to be able to change tactics completely and move elsewhere fairly quickly. She's full of electronics. She's been bristling both on the flybridge and down below, where I can drive her from either position. We use a Garmin plotter and fish finder. We also have that connected to another Garmin plotter and fish finder on the flybridge. We've obviously got a 48-mile radar. There are 3 fish finders on board, including side scan and forward-looking sonars, and obviously all of the relevant safety equipment that you would expect, DSC radios, as well as some of the more modern technology now, AIS radar, etc., etc.
Pretty explicit boat there. Sounds like you've got all singing, all dancing there. How many anglers do you take on that?
Well, the boat's actually licensed for 8. There are other 40-foot lock-ins operating around the country with licenses up to 12 or 14. But I actually went for 8 because I like to give more of a personal service. I think it's better for the anglers if they've got more room to move on the boat. And we do a lot of corporate business on the boat, so the boat's got quite a large cabin, which means that with our inclement weather throughout the year, it also gives us the opportunity to get out of the elements from time to time if we need to, and enjoy a lunch or coffees around a dining table, as well as enjoying the sport out on the deck.
Do you actually do any, you provide the proverbial tea and cakes for these anglers, or what? I mean, what's your full service for the day? Do they, and bait and stuff like that, what do you supply? What comes in with a full day package fishing with you?
It all depends on what the client actually requires. I mean, obviously I do individual and normal charter days, typically for local angling clubs or indeed individuals that might want to get into the start of sport fishing. Equally, I do a lot of corporate days. I'm fairly close to the city, which means we've got customer bases with the various bankers in the city. They come down, maybe only 2 or 3 people. They often require lunch as being part of the day, and they've found that the boat actually is a very economical way of doing a corporate day, as opposed to, for example, a day at the races or a day at the golf club. It's a great day for binding people together as well, especially if the elements aren't particularly good on that day. But I offer a full service depending on what's required. Always supplying coffee and tea, like most charter skippers, throughout the day, although sometimes that can be hard, especially when we're wreck fishing and drifting on the day. But yeah, we try and cater for everybody's needs depending on what they want. I also cater for young children. We do young father and son days, especially in the evenings when there's a few mackerel around during the summer. I've got a full set of good quality tackle on board. We tend to use Abu rods and reels as well as Penn Internationals, and they come as part of the package if people require it for rod hire on the day.
What sort of line do you use? I mean, when you say you're taking people out, obviously specialist anglers, they've probably got their own gear anyway. Corporate people perhaps wouldn't have their own gear. Individuals may or may not have it. Beginners obviously haven't got anything at all. So you supply tackle, but what about the line? Do you actually let them fish with braid, or do you tend to have higher outfits with mono on them? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we've got a very, very diverse type of fishing available to us from Littlehampton. If we're fishing in the deep water, then obviously I favour braid because it gives me the opportunity to still use light rods and less lead. So I've got reels on the boat which are spooled up with typically 30-40 pound braid. We would use those mainly for the wrecking or, as I say, in deep water. But equally I favour light tackle inshore fishing for bream and bass, and then I would typically use mono, which I think is a little bit user-friendly, especially for the novice, if you like. And then typically we've got the lines of sort of 15 and 20 pound class. But once again, it very much depends on what the species we're going for on the day. If we're going conger fishing, for example, or tope fishing, which both of those species are readily available to us in the summer months on the wrecks and banks off of Littlehampton, then we would probably up it to sort of 30 pound class rods, with bigger sort of Ambassador 7000 C size reels, and typically 40-50 pound line on those reels, and then 80 pound nylon for trace line.
Now, you carry all this on the boat? I mean, you got all this equipment there, or you tend to take it on as per what the client wants each time? You know, if he wants to go tope fishing, you load up with tope gear, or do you carry a lot of tackle with you, is what I'm trying to say? Yeah,
we carry a lot of tackle on the boat. We carry the tackle to really cover all aspects, including shark fishing on the boat, and simply because she has got a good return of speed, and we do have such a diverse amount of area that we can fish off of Littlehampton. We've mussel beds, we've wrecks, we've got sandbanks, and also we've obviously got the reef system, which is more widely known. So if we're having a bad day on one particular area, I can very, very quickly sometimes save the day by upping anchor, moving quickly to another area for a totally different style of fishing.
Now, I've noticed a big change. It's been, over 30 years since I've been down to Littlehampton, and the marina upriver now all seems new to me. It seems it's privately run now, and it seems like most of the charter boats like yourself go down from what I would call the Eastern Promenade. Are there any other plans for any extensions of marinas here, or is Littlehampton, is it gone as far as it can do, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, I think like most areas around the country which have got a sort of nautical background to them, the eastern side of Littlehampton has been very well developed over the last few years. Hence the reason a lot of the charter boats have now ended up in Pier Road on the eastern side near the Harbour Master's office. There are a lot of plans to now develop the western side of the river, which at the moment is fairly sparse. The development plans that I've seen include the use of a new all-singing, all-dancing marina facility where the golf club is at the moment. But of course, you're quite right, the marina now itself is privately owned. There's been a lot of development up at the marina, and if you go up there, you'll see an awful lot of boats, both on permanent moorings and or on the hard standing, as well as a slipway which is available to people coming with their own private boats. So we've actually now got a slipway on the east and west side of the river. So you've got easy access to the harbour entrance, no more than 5 minutes from each slipway.
Now, anybody using a small boat, I did actually go down and have a look at them, one in the private marinas, you say, upriver, and a really super wide one down in the town that's Pier Road, that's I guess what you call that. Anybody bringing a small boat down here, any tips or areas to avoid or just to beware of if you're taking a small boat down there yourself?
Well, I mean, absolutely. At the end of the day, it is a tidal river, and so you need to be conscious before you set out that you arrive and launch and, in fact, recover your boat at the right times of the tide. The river doesn't completely dry out. There is always water in the river, but you do need to be conscious of the fact of two things. Firstly, it's a very fast-flowing river. On a spring tide, you can get as much as 6 knots of speed from the harbour entrance itself, and also we have the sandbar across the entrance of the river itself. For safety issues, I would really tend to leave your entrance to the harbour within 3.5 to 4 hours each side of high water, and that really depends on both neap and spring tides for safety. You need to be conscious as well that you will sometimes see a bit of swell in the river, especially in the harbour entrance when we have a southeasterly wind of over force 4.
On your own boat for chartering, it's a bit of a generalisation this really, but are most of your trips mostly wreck fishing, or are they split between wreck fishing and inshore like tackle? How do you find what are people wanting now? What's the angler of today really looking for with his fishing?
Well, with the speed of the boat and with the fact that we've got over 100 wrecks, say within 20 or 30 miles of the harbour entrance, wreck fishing is still and does remain very popular. However, Littlehampton is very well known for its bream fishing, so it depends very much on the time of year, but I would suggest that between April and June we tend to specialise mainly in light tackle inshore for the bass and the bream. Moving out to the wrecks after June, we would fish the wrecks, say, between June and September, so we tend to be in deeper water. But we go as far afield as Alderney, for example. I take various crews to Alderney for the turbot and the brill. But getting closer to Littlehampton, we have sandbanks, mussel beds, all within ready distance. So we really cater for all different aspects of angling. There isn't a single species of fish that I don't think you can't catch from Littlehampton on the various grounds.
Now, one of the most famous marks a lot of people will be aware of is those Kingmere rocks. So where are they, and how deep, and over what area do they cover? And also, while you're on the subject, I mean, I've only ever heard of Kingmere here, but there must be other rocks and reefs. So other than Kingmere, what other marks are there that are rough ground, sort of breamy type marks?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Littlehampton's been known for years as being one of the best places in the country to come for bream fishing. We get a very, very large run of bream. They come here to spawn on our reef system, and I suppose it's better known as Kingmere rocks. What people don't understand is that the actual reef system itself extends considerably further out than just Kingmere rocks. It actually starts off of Bognor, right adjacent with Butlins. It then moves out across towards Middleton in a southeasterly direction, better known to the locals as West Ditch and East Ditch, disappearing again for maybe a mile, and then appearing off of Littlehampton almost 180 degrees south of Littlehampton, and better known as Black Ledge. Then it disappears again for about a mile, and then appears as the better known Kingmere Rocks, which is actually some 3 miles long and will almost run as far as Worthing. So the reef system itself is considerably larger than most people expect. The people off of Bognor have fished it for years for Selsey crab. There are a lot of lobster there, and not just bream. We get a lot of bass, we get a lot of pollock. We even see triggerfish on the reef system in more recent years.
Looking at the chart that we've got here in front of us, a portion of the Kingmere has a sort of section, a little bit of a notch cut out of it. What is that? Is that a good fishing area? Yeah,
a very good fishing area. That's the far eastern end of Kingmere, and it's better known to the locals as the Spur. Depending on the tide and the size of the tide, you really want to be fishing on the outer edges of the Spur, and these have always been probably the better known marks for the bigger bream in the early part of the year, and indeed a good place to start fishing for a second run of bream, although smaller, that we get around September and October.
Now, on the subject of bream, we know how famous it is. Just tell us exactly some of the numbers and the incredible size bream you have actually weighed here.
Well, over the years, obviously, unfortunately they've been exploited by the commercial fishermen who tend to come here every year, and we see them pair trawling. There are talks actually in the future of actually making the Kingmere a potential conservation area because of the fact that the bream do actually come here to spawn. It's not unusual for us to see fish as large as 5 and 6 pounds on the Kingmere, especially in the early part of the year, around end April and May being the peak time. If I was to go back into the harbour with 10 bream over 3.5 pounds, that wouldn't surprise any other charter skipper in our local area.
And they're all catching at this time of year. You know, that's just, you know, early summer, or I call it late spring, early summer. That's still the traditional time to come for the bream, is it?
It certainly is, but I mean, the second run of bream that we get in September, October, we actually tend to get just as many in terms of quantity. They're just slightly smaller fish, but they're still a good table-sized fish, 2.5 pounders. As I say, the fish have been exploited over the years, but they have seemed to make a bit of a comeback over the last 3 or 4 years. It's not unusual for an angler to go there at the right time of the year on the right day and catch 40 or 50 bream in a day.
Really? Now, something you just said there surprised me, is that you mentioned about they commercial fish them trawling, and I never even knew they commercial fish, you know, like that for the bream. So they must have really knocked them into a cocked hat, you know, if they're there for spawning. Is it just one boat, or are there several boats that used to do this years ago?
Well, unfortunately, we still have them even today, and every year without fail we see them. We do also see the fisheries people trying very, very carefully to monitor exactly what and where they're doing. They can't actually fish over the rock, so there is a little bit of sanctuary there for the fish, but unfortunately the fish don't actually spawn on the rock. The fish actually make nests just off of the rock, the little crater type nests, which they try and guard their eggs from other predators, and unfortunately that's when they're the most vulnerable. So the beam trawlers and pair trawlers in particular tend to concentrate on the areas on the edges of the rock, and you will see them going up and down throughout the early spring, where they do catch extremely large numbers of them. There has recently been a successful court case where the skipper of one of the commercial boats was heavily fined for the amount of fish that he was taking.
Really, it's interesting. Now, I'm just thinking now, because when I came 30 or more years ago, you know, they were just everywhere and we all took too many. It was just the way it was. But I wonder if the fact that, looking at the chart here, it's quite a complex set of rocks and ridges and everything. I wonder if modern GPS has something to do with the fact that those pair trawlers can now actually get really tight into the rocks. Do you think that's a theory, or is not necessarily, have they always just been good at catching the bream over the nests, if you like?
Well, not being a commercial fisherman, I don't really understand how they manage to fish for them so successfully, but I think with modern rock hopping gear, they have the ability to be able to get much closer to the rocks. Also, I think they now use nets which are relatively cheap to buy, especially if they end up ripping holes in them when they're going over the rocks. The problem is always the same, and that is they tend to get a good market price at the early part of the season for the bream, but as they catch so many, they very quickly flood the market, and it's such a shame that they get such a poor price for them after they've caught their allocation. With regards to conservation, I have to say anglers have changed their attitudes considerably over the years. Gone are the days when I used to see people returning with sackfuls of bream, some of which unfortunately used to be returned and thrown back to the sea. I'm pleased to say that most anglers that I have on the boat now take 1 or 2 fish for the table, and the rest are happily returned.
Well, it's good as the way it should be. Now, you did mention earlier to me, when I was taking some notes anyway, that you got a couple of tips on size of baits, and also, you know, not dropping the lead straight down, bouncing it back. Tell us a bit more about your own technique.
Yeah, well, absolutely. First thing I would suggest as a good tip, though, would be to the small boat fisherman that intends to come to Littlehampton to fish for the bream. You must remember you're going to be fishing on heavy rock, so one of the tips I would suggest is don't use an anchor as such. Use a grapnel, small grapnel with a very limited length of chain on it. That way, when the boat's actually turning in the tide, especially as you get to slack water, your chain won't actually wrap around a rock, and you've got a much better chance of actually retrieving your gear. With regards to the actual fishing for bream, I would suggest a 1/0 hook, which most anglers would think was fairly large. We tend to find that the bream have got lots of little small teeth, they're plucky little fish, and they bite very, very quickly in rapid succession. If you can put as much bait as you can on the hook, at least you will be confident that if you've missed a few bites, you've still got bait on the hook, and you'll be surprised. Bream tend to come back to the bait, and you'll very often get the opportunity to catch that same fish that was biting on another. You'll get another chance at the fish. One of the things we also do is we tend to fish in shallowish water. It's no deeper than 35 feet there. So cast a distance away from the boat so that you don't get any noise from the anchor or rope. Trot the baits back. So use a lead that's small enough to just touch bottom. And another little tip is to put a little floating bead above the hook. That just helps to lift the bait, especially if it gets masked by weed or rock over the Kingmere.
You've got other fishing here. We talked about the bream, but do you have any other fishing over, say, clean banks or mussel beds for species like plaice, brill, rays, that sort of species?
Absolutely, Graham. I mean, apart from the reef system which we've mentioned, which incidentally people just associate with bream, we catch a lot of undulate rays there, an undulate ray being obviously one of the rays that actually favours rock. So we catch a lot of undulate rays whilst we're actually bream fishing. And the other thing is that you often get very good quality bass running along the reef systems as well. I think I mentioned earlier, we've recently caught triggerfish over the reef, and we also get pollock, wrasse, and the various fish that you would expect to see over rock. However, apart from that, we have good mussel beds where you can expect to catch plaice. We've also got good sandbanks, especially down towards Bognor, where you'll see most of the other types of ray. We get good runs of smoothhound and tope, as well as obviously the wreck fishing for conger, ling and pollock. So as I said earlier, you can catch most species that are listed in the around the country from Littlehampton.
On that subject of mussel beds, I know a lot of the guys run up from the eastern Solent to fish for these big plaice. Now, just tell us what sort of size these plaice go to, how you fish for them, because they're quite impressive size fish.
Well, the area we actually fish for the mussel beds is very, very tidal, so you need to pick small tides where you can actually drift at a relatively good speed to be able to catch these plaice. The plaice that I personally have had one of £6.14 on this mark. We've had several over £5. It's not as good as it used to be, unfortunately, because it has been dived very, very frequently when the plaice arrive, and of course the way the plaice actually sits on the mussel beds means that he's an easy prey for the sport divers. It is only 35 feet of water, and it's quite easy for them to spear them. However, there are still good plaice to be had, and it's not unusual for us to get a bag of 20 or 30 plaice on a good day.
And what sort of tackling techniques? Any particular baits for those?
Well, I prefer using ragworm for the plaice. We do often use a spoon. Sometimes about 6 inches above the bait is ideal. A 5 foot flowing trace, I would suggest. And make sure that you're hopping the bottom as you drift through. So there's a lot of tide there. So I have known, 8 ounces of lead being the requirement. You need to be cautious. The mussel bed itself is quite large. It's about the size of 4 or 5 football pitches, and it is quite snaggy, so you don't want to go too light on the line. Even as high as 15 to 20 pound trace line is ideal.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I know they do get some good sport there. On the subject of flatfish still, I heard you mention you get some brill and some turbot, so what's that all about? I never heard of those from Littlehampton before.
Well, they're still a rare fish, anywhere in the country other than the places such as Alderney and the Channel Islands where they're well known. However, if there are any turbot or brill caught off of Littlehampton, they always come off the same areas, which is our Gascony Bank and Eastborough banks. They're well marked and shown on the charts. We tend to see the first of the blonde rays around April, and I fish for those hard on the bottom with a fairly short trace. Unfortunately, you need a fair amount of lead there, and you will only be able to fish there on the neap tides. But we've had blonde rays there well into the 20 pound. I've also caught a fair amount of undulates and small-eyed rays there. We get the small-eyed rays right the way through the season of the summer months, but you will catch brill, spotted rays, and various other, as well as bass there.
That's good. So you've got a mixture of fishing here. Now moving further offshore, because a lot of that sort of Kingmere and the places in shallow water. What is the wreck fishing scene like now? Because obviously you've got hundreds of wrecks out there that that were sunk during both First and Second World Wars. Are they actually fished out? Are they still worth sport fishing? And what sort of species would you aim for there?
Well, obviously, with this part of the channel was very heavily torpedoed during the wars, especially with us being fairly close to Portsmouth. We had probably in excess of 100 wrecks within 20 miles of Littlehampton Harbour entrance, and it's fairly true to say that over the years, especially with GPS technology now becoming readily available to the small boat owner, and of course outboard engines which give them a very good run of speed, the wreck fishing has, there's no doubt, got worse over the years. However, there are still good fish to be taken, although probably not the quantities that we used to see in the past. However, I'm tending to venture out to say 30-35 mile wrecks, where we are still seeing good quality pollock early in February when they're spawned up, as well as conger, ling, and of course cod, especially during the summer months. We tend to fish for those with the traditional methods of gilling, red gills, particularly black and red for the pollock, but I prefer the more modern shads for the cod, and indeed leadheads. Orange seems to be a particularly good colour, but we're fishing in excess of 180 feet for those fish.
So quite a bit of lead there. What would you recommend, like 20-30 pound boat rods, a bit heavier tackle, or can you still get away using braid with a lighter rod there?
Well, you can do, but I think because we're talking about ling to 20 pounds, if you're fishing for conger, obviously I've had them up to 70 pounds. Ideally, I think 30 pound, modern 30 pound class rods, I've not had any snap because of the size of a fish. They're ideal, especially when you twin them up with the more modern braids that are available on the market now. 30 pound of braid is adequate, and you'll find you'll need a lot less lead.
On your own rods and reels, just as a point of interest, would you spool the whole lot up with braid, or do you do what I've heard some anglers just topping? Now, if they've got 2 or 3 reels, they buy a metre, but say 100 or 200 metres on each reel with nylon underneath. I mean, what do? Do you buy a whole big bulk spool of braid?
No, I mean, braid is relatively expensive. What I tend to do is I put a good 100 yards of quality mono on the spool first. That actually stops the braid from bedding down as well into the spool, which I think is ideal. But what I also do is I like to put about 10 foot of shock leader onto the braid on the end of the line, so that you're still actually fishing with mono on that last bit. And I think that's ideal, especially with novices, because the first run of a good pollock, when it takes your lure over a wreck, you don't get any cushioning at all if you're just going direct to braid. And it's surprising how many pollock I've seen coming to the net with a huge hole in their mouth where the braid hasn't given any give whatsoever.
Now, you operate for a wide variety of species. For your own personal fishing, what's your favourite light tackle outfit on rods, reels, and the species? What do you actually physically enjoy most? Because you're out there almost every day of the year, I suppose, if you can get out with the weather. So what's your personal excitement factor, shall we say, for fishing?
Well, if you'd have asked me that question 3 or 4 years ago, I would have almost certainly answered as bass as being my main quarry. And to a certain extent, that is still some of the fishing I most enjoy, whether it be drifting with lures for the smaller shoal bass, or indeed live baiting the inshore wrecks for the bigger bass during the summer. However, I think now it has to be on a par with the big tope that we catch. We catch tope to 50 and 60 pounds during the summer months, and I think they're probably the finest sport fish that we have in our area, and probably the most likely fish that you've got to compare with big game fishing outside of the UK.
Yeah, they are pretty exciting. I quite like shallow water tope fishing. I see you've got 2 logbooks here, which you must fill out pretty regularly, and I couldn't help thumbing through it, and I saw some absolutely frightening statistics on bass, with some huge numbers of bass, and you're catching these in the autumn and winter. So what's that all about?
Yeah, absolutely, Graham. I've been keeping these logbooks ever since I started charter fishing. I think I've now got 5 filled in over the years. And in fact, I keep one on the boat for the clients to look at as well. It gives them an idea of what's being caught at that time. Basically, at the end of every single day, whether it be a good or a bad one, I come back and I fill in this logbook, mainly for my own use. It gives me an idea of where I caught the fish, what type of tide, was I'm always looking for a factor that might help me in my quest to continually find fish. With regards to the bass, we get a good run of bass in the spring and autumn. They tend to be shoal fish, and they tend to be feeding heavily on the sprats that shoal up in our area at this time of year. For that reason, on a day when they're on the feed, we often drift through them with lures, and we can catch phenomenal numbers of them. Once again, being conscious of the conservation side of things, we tend to return a great deal of those fish. But during the course of the day, we will always see some of the bigger fish turning up amongst them as well. So yeah, bass fishing still remains one of my favourite forms of fishing. But I think ideally, the months of July through to September are my favourite, when we actually target big bass on inshore wrecks with live bait mackerel.
And what sort of size fish are you talking? I thought I did see one on your website. I think, was it £13.9? Is that the biggest one you've had?
£13.9 is actually the biggest one we've had over the last year, but we catch probably in excess of 30 bass a year, I would say over £10. The biggest one we've ever had on the boat is just under 15. But they're extremely rare fish, you know. I mean, we catch a lot of bass between 7 and £10, but it's a bit like a golfer. If you didn't get a hole in one, if it's not £10, it's not £10. I often see a big bass, magnificent looking fish, which I expect to be bigger, and then sometimes disappointed to see it go £9.3 on the scales. If it's not £10, it's not £10.
Well, you've got to leave those scales at home. I've done that one myself with a lot of different species and wish I'd never put it on the scales. Now, on those numbers, you give us the sizes. You know, what have you done? I mean, it looks like sort of 50s, 60s, even more you've had in a day, you know, albeit a lot of them return. But what sort of numbers do you remember getting with the big catches of numbers of fish?
It's not unusual for us to have in excess of 100 in one day. I think actually the record for the boat is 300 and something. So, yeah, we've had a few.
That's amazing. Any sharks? I mean, you were talking earlier on these fantastic tope fishing you get, and I heard you mention you hooked up to a thresher. What was the story on that? And give us a rundown. Have you done any poor beagle fishing, or does anybody indeed go poor beagle shark fishing anymore?
Well, years ago, Littlehampton, believe it or not, was actually quite well known for shark fishing. In fact, the lady record for the area, the British record for the area was caught by a lady angler from Littlehampton. For the past few years, I've been trying very, very hard to catch either a thresher or a poor beagle off of the more commonly known areas off the Isle of Wight, which in actual fact is only about a 40-mile run for us, so we can safely get there within an hour and a half where we start our drifts. But the thresher that we did hook last year, we had on for an hour and a half before we lost it, unfortunately, and that was on a day when we were tope fishing. But yeah, they are there to be caught, and every year we see sightings of them. With regards to poor beagles, unfortunately we don't see them enough for me to actually go out and target them. But every year when we're wreck fishing, somebody will be reeling in either a ling or a cod, and it will come up bitten in half, where it's been taken by a poor beagle halfway up. I've also had poor beagles following hooked fish right up to the boat, you know, which is normally my first knowledge of it is when an angler says, "Look at the size of this thing. Yeah. We need a bigger boat." So they are there to be caught. I would dearly love to catch one, and we're trying hard.
Well, you've got to be in it to win it, as they say. There's one point there that I think is worth picking up on. You mentioned about having the poor beagle follow up, a hookfish, a cod or a pollock. You told me a tip which I didn't know about before, about the returning of bass, you know, when you're doing catch and release fishing. What was that? You know, you don't return it, or you do return it a certain way. What was that about, returning the bass? It might spook the others. Yeah,
I've definitely found over the years that, especially in our shallow water areas, that when the bass are feeding heavily, they tend to move with the boat along with the hooked fish. I've found over the years that if we definitely hold on to the bass that we don't wish to keep until the end of the drift before returning them, we've tended to have better numbers and more success. It's still my belief, therefore, that if we actually release fish on top of the feeding shoal, don't ask me how, but it tends to spook them. So I tend to quietly go up tide of the shoal, switch my engines off and indeed my sounders. We drift quietly over the feeding shoal, taking one or two fish over the shoal, and then if they're not of size, we put them into a bucket of water, wait till we're safely away from the shoal and return them. By doing that, that gives us the opportunity to fish for them throughout the day.
You mentioned something else I picked up on there. Other than return, you switch your sounder off. Do you think they're disturbed by the sounder? I mean, you have to locate them initially by the sounder, but the signals, do you think might put the fish on edge a bit?
I'm not sure if it's actually the sounder or the engines. All I can definitely tell you is that on days when the bass are feeding heavily, very often the seagulls are giving them away as they're diving down on the opportunity for themselves to catch sprats. I have known in the past for several boats, therefore, to come into the area very, very quickly. And very, very quickly, I've also seen the shoals scatter and or go deep, or indeed stop feeding completely. On days when I've been on my own and able to turn the engines and sounder off, as I said earlier, it's given me the opportunity to fish for them literally throughout the whole day without spooking them.
Yeah, well, I mean, you need all the pluses in your favour you can get nowadays. With less fish about, it's getting harder and harder. Up this way, obviously, in the winter fishing, is the cod. What's your sort of take on the cod fishing scene over the last few years, and what do you think of it for the future? What do you think it holds size-wise and numbers for the anglers?
Well, that's an interesting question, and there's no doubt about it. We've seen more cod in the last couple of years than I can remember for a long time, and I think that's probably because of some of the legislation that's been put on the commercial people catching them over the last years. Littlehampton isn't perhaps as well known as other areas locally for cod. We don't have the depth of water that, for example, they get east of Brighton and down that way. However, we still catch cod here in relatively good numbers, especially on the wrecks in the summer. We still get a very, very good run of channel whiting, but this year in particular, it's not uncommon for the cod to be running in the teens. So, in fact, only yesterday one of the boats came back with 3 18-pounders. So there are still cod to be caught here, and I would say that the size of the cod is increasing. This year I'm particularly looking forward to the wreck fishing. There's been considerably larger numbers of cod caught in the commercial nets, and that size seems to be bigger than last year. Most of those fish by the end of March will start their move back out onto the wrecks. Where they're congregated in a smaller area, we tend to have some very good numbers of cod coming to the boat.
So there you have it. Anybody listening to this, it looks like this spring and summer you might get some big cod over the wrecks. Well, Neil, thank you very much for all that information. We all know that the south coast of England is pretty dire in January and February, and I've heard a little whisper on the grapevine that you might be starting up a charter operation in warmer foreign climes. Now, I've heard Kenya mentioned as one of the places I've also been to many years ago. Great fishing there, so are you going to let us in on the secret? Are you going to tell us what you're thinking about for perhaps next winter?
Yeah, I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that the period between November through to March is very often cold. It's very, very difficult getting a day out dependent on the weather. We tend to get more wind, and I'm really looking forward to being able to extend my business throughout the year. So with that in mind, I've been looking at Antigua, Tobago, and various other destinations around the world where we might be able to operate. I think at the moment our favourite is probably coming out as Watamu in Kenya. Over the years, they seem to have developed a fairly large fishery around the hotel there, predominantly looking for sailfish, black and striped marlin. I think it's a good opportunity, and it's something that I need to look at a little more deeply over the next few months.
Well, we wish you luck with both the fishing in the UK and obviously abroad. And I'd rather like to be recording you when you're in Kenya. That's a nice warm place to go. So thanks very much to Neil French, owner and skipper of the Spirit of Arran. Anybody interested in getting in touch with him from this podcast, phone on 07831 848 561, or you can try the website www.spiritofaran.co.uk. So thanks very much, Neil, and hopefully we're going to hear something in the fishing press from you as well.